So, to sum up the story so far, we can say that from void comes substance, from standing pole comes whole body unified force. And from there, we know from our previous discussion of the logical model that if we want to transform this into martial arts practice, then we need to be able to hit people. And if we're going to hit people, we need to be able to generate kinetic force. And there's only one way to do that. We need to move one part of our body in relation to another. And we also discussed that when we do that, it can either be one part of our body moves away from another part of our body, or it can be that one part of our body moves closer to another part of our body. That is summed up in the simplest terms, because obviously when we do complex movement, there's lots of different parts of the body moving in different ways. But in absolute basic essence, one part moves away from another part, or another part moves closer to another part. And we can do that explosively either way, what we call Fa Li. That's getting a little bit ahead of the model. And this principle then divides into two. So you can see what's happening here. From void, it goes to the creation of substance, and all this mystical sounding stuff all relates to perfectly straightforward physiological concepts. From void, we go to substance, and then the substance divides into these two things, moving away and moving close to. And moving away is what we call opening, and when part of your body moves towards another part of the body, that's called closing, or at least in the simplest possible terms, that's open and close. And so from there, I want to read another quote. This time, it's a quote from Chen Taiji Chuan Master Wu Gongzhao, and it's from his 1936 book, Taiji Chuan Boxing Explained, and that's available courtesy of Brennan Translations on the internet for free, which is a fantastic resource, as I've mentioned before. Check that out if you love reading old wushu manuals. And in this first quote, Wu is quoting Chen Pin San. And if you don't know who Chen Pin San was, he's a very famous Chen Tai Chi master who was also a very deep intellect, and he wrote a lot of stuff about the theory of Chen Tai Chi Chuan, which is incredibly deep and worth checking out, whether you're interested in, well, whatever kind of martial arts you're interested in, but particularly Chinese martial arts. So all of this is a quote from Chen Pin San from Wu. And Wu says, Chen Pin San said, "Open and close, emptiness and fullness, these are the keys to the art. We should understand that when we don't have centeredness, there's no opening and closing." End quote. Well, actually, he carries on with the quote, but that's the bit of the quote that we need. And see there the similarity between what Miyamoto Musashi was saying in the previous video about the importance of centeredness and everything flowing from that. And while we're on the subject of Musashi, he also tells us a lot of other interesting things around understanding natural movement. And I've mentioned before that Musashi didn't have a very strong formal background in martial arts training. So at first he was a little bit embarrassed when people used to ask him, where did you learn martial arts? And he used to say that he mostly learned from nature. And then later on, where he flowered into a profound genius across multiple different areas. I mean, he was a legit old master painter in the Japanese traditional style, as well as an architect, poet, sculptor, absolutely top level in everything that he did. And he used to say that, well, he just follows the way. He doesn't have a teacher. He says specifically in the Book of Five Rings, master of multiple things, but without a master. But how do we conceptualize this idea of learning from nature? And it's not just about observing things and then trying to mimic something that happens in nature. That doesn't... Yeah, there's these stories that Wang Shanzhai students used to watch animals fighting, like they used to do cockfights and things like that and watch how the animals moved, but there's no reason why you shouldn't learn an insight from watching a machine function or how a computer works or anything, something that someone's created. So it doesn't really mean that in that sense. It means following the natural principles as you experience them, as a being that's evolved and been designed to fit into the laws of physics, understanding your own movement in relationship to the world around you. And I know that for people who are looking for really mystical out there stuff in Chinese martial arts, they very often don't want to think like that. And they forget that the way is not far from the people. So it's actually the incredibly simple things that are just the most beautiful when you stop and think about them. So the way we first understand open and close isn't through moving or trying to punch, it's just through breathing. So if you imagine just doing standing pole, well, you don't have to imagine doing it because you've been doing it. So when you do standing pole, and then just focus on your breathing and think about the importance of breathing in wushu in the past, particularly in the so-called Neijia arts. So when you get deep into your understanding, your physical manifestation of whole body unified force, it changes your perception of breathing because your whole body starts getting involved. I saw someone saying that you only breathe with your lungs, and that's physiologically not true. If you only try to breathe with your lungs, you die. I mean, when I say I saw someone who's presenting themselves as an Yiquan teacher saying that breathing is obviously a very complex physiological process and it requires the use of the diaphragm. And when you enter into a state of whole body unified force when you're standing, your breathing feels like expanding and contracting, and that's how we first learn the idea of open and close, or in the logical model, that's how we understand it. So we go from the void into the centeredness of whole body unified force, so the creation of substance, from there into our breathing, from which we learn open and close, expand and contract, which then flower into open and close. And this is what we mean by learning by nature, learning through nature. And you won't find everything in an old wushu manual. A lot of it you have to experience and feel for yourself, see the logic of it. And this feeds back into this idea that I talked about of thinking about, where does legitimacy come from? Just because your teacher or your teacher's teacher said it doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. Just because Wang Shangjai said it doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. And Wang Shangjai himself says this, and he's the one who tells us, look at the logic of the model itself. If it goes beyond the logic of the model, you're into a different model. And also, if your understanding of how to understand is based on looking at the logic of the system, not in our school we don't do that, therefore it's wrong. And as a side note on that, look at how often in Yiquan this idea of being free from form has devolved into the most absolute adherence to form imaginable. Compare, for example, with Chen Taiji Chuan, where from teacher to student there is often massive variation. There's a lot of creativity around how you can do Chen Taiji Chuan forms. Whereas in Yiquan, people have devolved into, if you don't do it exactly the way that my teacher did it, then it's absolutely, totally wrong. Well, how is that formlessness? Anyway, that being what it is, once we understand this idea of open and close, and we link that into the other idea that we learned, which is skewing postures, they have to link together, because open and close can be done with a balanced movement, what we call double weightedness. And when you do it with a balanced movement, you lose the ability to link the whole structure into the posture and down to the rooting point, or it becomes much weaker. Hence in each one we say that if you do a movement with double weightedness, well, Wang Shangjai calls it a sin, but he means it idiomatically, like think about it, don't use double weightedness. And there are lots of things in each one where people have said things and we don't understand why they're talking about them because we've lost the context. So there's something that Yao Zongzun says about Wang Shangjai telling him that even if you push with both hands, one hand should be dominant. So there should always be single weightedness at the strike point, because a double weighted strike isn't as strong as a single weighted strike. And that's everything we looked at when we looked at health Yiquan and combat based Yiquan, that in health Yiquan you can have a balanced posture, but balanced whole body unified force is, relatively speaking, useless on its own for combat. We always want it to be single weighted if possible. So from there we understand and learn that we need to skew posture. So in simplest terms, because we can come back and we will come back to this idea of single and double weightedness, in the simplest terms from what we've looked at so far, we need to skew the posture for all the reasons that we've talked about before. Now, when we use whole body unified force, this can become an incredibly complex calculation for how we use what is in fact a very complex physical structure, i.e. a human body. But for the sake of simple understanding, we usually break it down into a system of two axes. So what we traditionally call the spine axis and the qua axis. So the spine axis, as I've said before, it's not really in line with the spine. It's created by centrifugal force. In terms of the actual laws of physics, it's a virtual reality axis created by centrifugal force that goes down usually further forward in your body than where the actual spine is. But this is the traditional way of thinking about it. And if we've got left foot forward, right foot back, if we push the left side of the body forward, this is how we're skewing the posture to hit with the left hand. We call that open because that's opening the qua, or that's how it feels. And if we push the right side of the body forward and we hit with the right hand, which is our rear hand, equivalent to say a cross or a rear hand hook, that's closed because it feels like the qua and the legs are moving towards one another. It's never quite that simple, and that's why you'll often see in the Tai Chi Chuan manuals people saying like open contains close and close contains open and stuff like that. It's not just being overly mystical and contradictory. It's just explaining the complexity of the movement once we move beyond this fairly simple way of explaining movement within Chinese physical culture. And because of the complexity of the human body, people soon start working out that you can do a lot more than just open and close around the spine axis. You can open and close around the qua axis as well, so you can fold your body in two. So we have these two major axes that work together, but they both use the principle of open and close. So if you bend at your waist and lean forward, that's close, and if you push your back backwards, that's open. So it's the same principle of open and close, it's just expressed along a different axis. And you can find lots of people talking about this in the old wushu manuals, particularly Tai Chi Chuan. But I'll give another quote from Wu Gongzhou. He's done an interesting thing in this book. He's created a kind of Platonic dialogue where he's imagined someone is asking him questions about Tai Chi Chuan and he's giving answers to them. And this is one of the answers that he gives. And he says, quote, "The techniques involve the whole body and centeredness also involves the whole body. But since beginners are not equipped to understand this, they ought to just confine themselves to seeking the mechanism of opening and closing to the left and right in the spine, and the mechanism of opening and closing above and below in the waist." End quote. And sometimes people say to me, oh, Wang Xiangjia moved past all of that stuff, he created something entirely new. That's absolutely not true. If you read these old manuals, you'll pretty much see everything that Wang Xiangjia talks about, whether it's natural movement, not exerting yourself, the power of intent. These were all completely bog standard quintessence principles of wushu. And in a very similar vein, you find Wang Xiangjia talking about opening and closing at the spine axis and the qua axis. I wonder if I can find that quote if I just have a quick look for it. I'll tell you what, before I do that, I'll just give another quote from Wu Gongzhou, and he says, "Practitioners of Tai Chi boxing seek for opening and closing within every posture, in every movement, very deliberately control it by the use of intention. But within opening and closing, there's breathing involved. Exhaling makes opening, inhaling makes closing." So you will find all these old Tai Chi masters talking about intention, just like Wang Xiangjia does. So there's this weird thing that people do where they say that in Tai Chi Chuan everyone was talking about qi, and Wang Xiangjia created this revolution where he was talking about intention, and that's absolutely a fabrication. Everyone was talking about intention. But also notice the quotes that I've picked out are just saying exactly the same things that I've been saying here. Yes, so you find Wang Xiangjia saying lots of things about the waist and the spine axis. So, for example, these are all from his book on breaking hands. "The coordination between the waist, spine and limbs must be seamless, ensuring the force is evenly distributed." Then a bit later on he says, "The success of the clash depends on the push-off force from my virtual foot and the twisting and swaying of my waist and spine. These two movements must coordinate harmoniously to convert my body's kinetic potential into whole-body gravitational kinetic energy." That's the kind of thing that people sometimes translate as cosmic force or gravitational waves, as I said before, but you can see from a better translation that he's just trying to find a very straightforward scientific language. Similarly, in modern Yiquan, we don't usually use these ideas of spine and quad axis anymore. We say horizontal and vertical axis. It represents a much more accurate description. But nevertheless, the same idea applies, that there's an infinite number of complex interreactions between these two when we move into more advanced movements, and that allows us to do lots of interesting things. But Wang Xiangjia uses this idea constantly. So again, from breaking hands, he says things like, the key to this technique lies in the wave force generated by the twisting and swaying of my waist and spine. Or, using the waist and spine as the axis, extend both arms forward with the left hand in front and the left foot stepping forward, and so on. See if there's any more here. Yeah, again, using the waist and spine as a vertical axis, the whole body rotates 180 degrees. In fact, he says it so many times I'm not going to read them all out. Practice should involve alternating between left and right, advancing and retreating, using the twisting and swaying of the waist and spine to drive the rotation of both arms, swallowing the opponent's strength with the rotation of the arms, which is extremely effective and efficient in application, devoid of any sluggishness. So our model has gone from the void into creation of substance, into the single concept of expanding and contracting, which has then been transformed into open and close. With the use of skewing the posture, it's been transformed into usable martial arts techniques. And then the two things have divided again into four things: open, close, rise, and sink. And just as hold the centre corresponds to the element of earth, so all of these things correspond to the other five elements in traditional Chinese five-element theory. Do you know what they are off the top of your head? So they're all very traditional understandings of what these elements mean. So wood corresponds with opening because wood expands. Metal corresponds with closing because metal closes and buckles. Fire corresponds with sink because fire sinks, and water rises, so it corresponds with rise. So you have hold the centre, earth, and then open, close, rise, and sink. Open, wood, close, metal, rise, water, fire, sink. And don't forget, back in the day, people didn't have straightforward scientific language, so it wasn't entirely clear how you should talk about any of these things. And it's also incredibly useful, so if you know this coded language, you can actually learn a lot from it, and that's a good reason to have a coded language in the first place, because this framework is a way of working out problems. And I'll give a really good example from my own experience. I was working with hitting the shoulder, lead shoulder, hitting the punch bag, and that's usually the only thing you ever see in each one. It's the only thing I learned. And when you hit with the front shoulder, you use pretty much 100% open. That's how you do the posture. You can do it on the spot or with a step, but either way, you just use open, and that's how you maximize force. But you would think from there that if you're going to hit with the rear shoulder, that you use close. It stands to reason, doesn't it? It's just the opposite thing on the other side, but actually there's a difference in distance usually between you and the opponent, and even when there isn't, just the shape of your body in relation to the target means that it turns out that actually you don't just use close. So it was a little bit of a problem at first, like I couldn't make it work. And then when I brought it into this paradigm, open, close, rise and sink, because this is a problem-solving matrix, you bring it into that paradigm, and then I was able to experiment, and then I could work out from there that it's around about 70% close, 30% sink. What we're doing physically is much more complex than that, and it's the kind of thing Wang Xiangjia, well, it's exactly the thing Wang Xiangjia is talking about finding that harmony between the waist axis and the quad axis. It's a really complex physical movement, particularly to do it with whole body unified force and Fa Li. But having that very straightforward problem-solving matrix helps you strip it down to a conceptualization that's really, really simple. You don't have to worry about anything like that. You can just think in very basic terms, well, what if I just add in a little bit more of one of these core elements? And from there, you can also analyze other people's movements. So you can see, for example, that the Yao brothers, when they do a jab, mostly only use open. Whereas I don't know why, but for whatever reason, my coach does it, pretty much exactly the same way I do it, like 70% open, 30% rise, which you can scientifically demonstrate is more powerful than just using close on its own. It brings in a different element of structure to it that strengthens it for that particular posture. Some postures primarily only use one of the elements and some use more. In reality, they all always use all of them because it's the nature of the complexity of the human body. It's just a heuristic device that helps us problem solve and look at other people's movement and understand how they move. So once you get that, you can take that idea and you can look at, for example, let's say just thinking about other Yiquan practitioners, you can look at their movement and you can see how they are doing postures, how are they using open, close, rise and sink. And that also means that you can have postures that are within the Yiquan paradigm, but which are not necessarily the best way of doing it. So the way that the Yao brothers do a jab, for example, is scientifically, demonstrably not the best way to do it within the Yiquan paradigm. It's too flat, it's too much use of open. But another really good example I saw was someone who was doing a jab. It was an instructional video on how to do an Yiquan jab, and the instructor was doing the jab using close, which we would normally use to do a cross. And you can scientifically demonstrate that even though that's within the Yiquan paradigm to do that, and there might be an exceptional case where you would do that, overall, it's the wrong way to do it. You should use open. It's more powerful. Anyway, I'll just flag up here as we finish off this segment that no way is it that simple. Nothing ever is in Yiquan. Things change when we shift from striking to having our hands on and doing push hands and wrestling. And in many cases, we reverse the order in which we want to do things. So where we would use the front hand with open when striking, very often when we're doing push hands, we use the front hand with close. That's a whole other story.